Good morning. My name is Cibils, and the title of my talk today is Adaptation of Rangeland Beef Production to Climate Change in the Desert Southwest. I would like to begin by introducing my co-authors, Dr. Rick Estelle, Matt McIntosh, Dr. Shelemia Nyamurekunge, Dr. Sherry Spiegel, and Alfredo Gonzalez, who sadly passed away earlier this year. What I would like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is first talk about climate and climate trends, especially as in relation to the southwestern United States. Then talk more broadly about adaptation strategies to these new climate scenarios, and especially one such adaptation strategy that consists of using heritage cattle on desert rangelands, and finally talk about the challenges that we believe we have ahead and what we are currently doing to address those. Most of you in the audience have seen these graphs showing the trends, global trends in warming and change in composition of gases in the lower atmosphere. And in this graph, of course, the gray line shows the increasing trend in atmospheric CO2, and the bar chart in the background shows the anomalies in air temperature, global anomalies in air temperature averaged across the planet. And the line that you see in the forefront of the graph are the anomalies for New Mexico that, as you would expect, are somewhat more extreme than the global averages. But in general, we see this trend, warming trend, that is especially pronounced for us here in New Mexico since about the middle of the 1970s. Most of the global circulation models that predict our global climate system anticipate that for the Western United States, the effects of climate change will be region dependent, and so will depend on where you are in the West. For us in the Southwest, so the red area on the map you are seeing now, climate change in general will mean hotter and drier climates and a projected decrease in production potential of our native grasslands, especially for us here in New Mexico and in Arizona. And we have seen this trend play out in probably over the last couple of decades, and apparently this will become more pronounced as we move into the future. An analysis of climate variables and grazing level livestock numbers in the state of New Mexico from 1920 all the way to 2017, I believe, shows for the period beginning in the mid-1970s, an increase that is statistically significant in air temperatures and a related decrease in grazing level, the number of livestock grazing our rangelands. And as you all know, approximately 90% or more of New Mexico is classified as rangeland and is grazed by livestock at some point, sometime in the year. So livestock grazing and management of rangelands for animal agriculture is important to the economy of New Mexico, is important to the livelihood of many New Mexicans that depend on rangelands, partly or entirely for their livelihood. Global analyses of other climate variables that appear to be changing in addition to increased temperatures suggests that for certain parts, that in certain parts of the grazed area of the drylands and grasslands of the planet, the variability, the interannual variability in annual precipitation is increasing. And if you look at this map and look at the desert Southwest, you can see that we have basically red and yellows here, which imply that between 1901 and 2014, the year-to-year variability in precipitation has tended to increase. And we know that this has important implications for the life forms, plant life forms that grow on our rangelands and for the composition of our plant communities. There is some research that has shown that increased variability in annual precipitation favors shrubs over grasses. And so the process of shrub encroachment that began late in the 1800s with improper grazing of some of our desert rangelands is probably going to continue to occur in part under these new climate change scenarios. So the image you see here is basically the systems that we work in. This is the northern Chihuahuan Desert, and this is what our landscapes look like. We have a mix, of course, of shrubs and grasses and forbs, and the predominant forage layer for most of our native and domestic ungulates for cattle grazing that is our particular interest lies in the herbaceous layer of the plant communities. So we're using, again, native forages. Most of those are warm season forages as the base of beef production on a lot of our ranches. We have tracked forage production, so herbaceous forage production, at our research site, not far from where this photograph was taken, for the last 30 years. And one of the things we see is this decreasing trend in valuable grass production. And so when compared to the late 1980s, we are currently our current forage production has been reduced by about 43%. And what this means, of course, is that then the productive capacity, the grazing capacity of ranches in this area has also declined across this period. And of course, this affects the financial viability and sustainability of a lot of our operations. And along with this decline in forage production, we see this significant increase in mean maximum annual temperature. So we see this scenario of a hotter environment that, of course, becomes drier, playing out in our region. And again, this related decrease in forage production. And this is at our research site north of Las Cruces, New Mexico, where we have conducted a number of long-term studies looking at both vegetation, forages, and livestock production as well. So within this context of change and this context of drier and hotter climates and less forage production, there are, of course, a number of adaptation strategies and tactics that a producer might follow to cope with this new situation. And of course, producers are, ranchers are used to dealing with weather variability. But one of the things we see with the climate scenario as it's playing out and as it's predicted to play out is that extremes in weather that are sort of outside of the normal range of variation or the historical range of variation are likely to put additional pressures on our systems. So this is a general conceptual model of a recent paper evaluating the effect of climate change on the ranching industry in the Western United States. And I'm going to spare you some of the details, But for us in the desert Southwest, the trend appears to be a trend towards aridification. And what we think is that the strategies that will apply to this emerging situation are strategies associated with sustainable or tactics associated with a strategy of sustainable extensification. And that eventually we will basically have systems that are purely pastoral to be both ecologically and financially sustainable. And of course, the specific adaptation tactics that one could use are varied, and I won't go through all of them. I want to focus on one specifically, and this is on what cattle breeds are used. And so as aridification increases, we believe that the use of heritage livestock breeds, so livestock breeds that have many, many years of adaptation to harsh environments, but that of course produce less than improved breeds, are probably going to become more important as a tool to adapt to these changes. And so this is an area where for the past 12 to 15 years, researchers here in southern New Mexico have been conducting sort of focused research. Back in the early 2000s, a herd of criollo cattle were introduced to southern New Mexico from the Copper Canyon in Chihuahua, Mexico. And these are a type of criollos known as Raramuri criollos and are raised by the Tarahumara peoples in the Sierras, the Tarahumara in Chihuahua. And historically, they've been selected as a dual purpose animal, an animal that can produce some milk, that can also produce beef, and that is occasionally used as a draft animal to plow fields and do that sort of thing as well. It's also been selected to be, or is used to be handled quite a bit. So these are fairly tame animals, despite their intimidating horns and so. And so one of the things that research has focused on over the past 10 to 12 years is on describing the way that these cattle use desert landscapes. A lot of the next 5 slides in my talk are going to basically deal with results of studies where telemetry was used to track these animals and to see how they behave when faced with a desert environment, and how that behavior compares to the improved beef breeds that we commonly raise in this area. And so you see this cow here, this criollo cow and her calf, and you see she's wearing 2 collars, and one of these collars is a GPS collar, of course, that it's a store on board GPS that will record location of the cow at frequent intervals. And so after a month or so of sampling, we would go bring the cow back in and pull the data down and map the data and analyze it to try and understand pasture use patterns and feeding habits. And the other collar that you see, the black collar on the neck of this cow, is a proximity logger. And what this proximity logger does is it basically logs contact events with other animals wearing this same device. In this case, you can see the calf here wearing a proximity logger as well. And our interest was in part in describing mothering style. So what is the nature of the contacts between the cow and the calf while on rangeland? So early studies looking at habitat use patterns of criollo cows, this is the column on the right-hand side of your screen, versus Angus Hereford improved beef breed on the left-hand side, showed that at different points in the year, these animals either diverge in their pasture use patterns or converge. And so we see divergence happening when the forages are brown or dormant. And the divergence occurs because criollo cattle tend to spread out across the landscape and use the landscape differently. when things are green and good, the grazing patterns of both breeds tend to converge. And so you see them both using relatively smaller areas of the pasture. This, we believe, has implications both for animal production and for pasture sustainability. And so we have collaborated with partners across the Americas, so other partners in the United States, but also with colleagues in Chihuahua, Mexico, and colleagues in northwestern Argentina that have conducted similar studies or are conducting currently additional studies, making these sorts of comparisons. So in slightly different environments, the interest is to see how these animals with heritage genetics that are more hardy, although lower producing, use these semi-arid and arid habitats. In Mexico, one of the early studies conducted in the foothills of the Sierras, the environment, of course, is still semi-arid, but slightly different to the Chihuahuan desert environment that I showed earlier. We see basically similar patterns when comparing criollos with a similar genetic background to the ones that were introduced into New Mexico and British beef breeds. We see that in times of the year when vegetation is scarce, for this site, this was spring of the year this study was conducted, we see criollos spreading out more, and the British beef breed Hereford cows in this case using smaller areas of the pasture. This is probably the only of the sites where we've compared the breeds where the topography is very rugged as well. And so in addition to animals spreading out across the landscape, we see criollo cows using rugged terrain more so than British beef breeds. And then when we look at the season of the year, in this case, it was fall when forage is plentiful, we see both breeds doing very similar things. So again, the same pattern that we observed in New Mexico that we believe, of course, has implications on both the pasture and the animal. A recent study completed in Argentina, northwestern Argentina, the province of La Rioja, showed some similarities with what we've seen in North America, both in the United States and Mexico. In this case, the cattle that is used is Argentinian criollo cattle, slightly different genetics, but in general, a similar animal to the one that was used at the other sites. And a British breed here, Argentine Angus cows. So the relative difference in genetics between these two groups, we think is somewhat analogous to the differences in genetics among the breeds compared at the North American sites. And here what you see again, summer is being the green season with plenty forage, and winter being the season of dormant forage and less of it. We see the criollo cattle doing very different things in summer and in winter. Whereas the British beef breed basically exhibiting the same grazing patterns at both times of the year. When we look at all of these data collectively, so if we look at the New Mexico sites, the Argentina site, the Chihuahua, Mexico site, and plot the variation in daily distance travel, so this is one behavior metric, in response to a decrease in rangeland forage biomass or quality. So if we compare the green time of the year versus the brown, so when forage is green versus when it's brown, and we see how animals behave in response to this, what you see in the graph below is percentage-wise the difference in daily distance traveled by criollo cows in these studies, and these are your orange bars, versus the British beef breeds, and these could be Angus or Herefords or crosses of these. And consistently what we see at all sites is that there is a lot more contrast in the behavior of criollos when faced with good and bad quote unquote, forage conditions compared to the British breeds. We believe that this behavioral plasticity shows an ability to adapt to a changing environment. And this is what natural grasslands, rangelands are about. They vary a lot from season to season and from year to year. And having an animal that can adapt its foraging strategies to basically match what is happening in the environment is, we believe, very important for the sustainability of these systems as we move into a time with more variation, more weather extremes, more droughts and hotter environments. So why? What are the underlying processes that allow these heritage animals to behave differently and to adapt as they do and to use the rangelands in a different way than the British breeds that we have traditionally raised, that again are more productive, but that require more inputs and that are apparently less adept to adapting to these seasonal and interannual changes in environmental conditions. Well, the first, and I won't walk you through all of what's happening in this graph, but the first important thing is differences in heat tolerance. So if you look at the summer part of this graph, we've got temperature in degrees centigrade on the vertical axes, and we have 4 periods of the day on the horizontal axes here. So if you look at the 2 curves above, the top one is body temperature for Angus Hereford cross cattle in the Chihuahuan Desert. And what you see here is that, and then the bottom curve here, sorry, this line represents body temperature for Criollo cattle grazing the same environment during summer. And you see that a dawn body condition of both breeds of animals, these are cows of both breeds, is the same. And as the day progresses and it gets hotter in the summer, you basically see both curves diverging. By the end of the day, the body temperature of the Angus Hereford is about almost a degree centigrade hotter than the body temperature of the Criollo cows. There are a number of reasons why we think that Criollo cows might be better at dissipating heat during the day and accumulating less heat load. This is important because it affects their foraging behavior, their foraging strategy, and some of the differences we see in their activity patterns and in the places on the rangelands where they go, we think can be closely tied to this phenomenon of higher heat tolerance that is important for many of our hot, arid and semi-arid environments, and that is important in a climate where we're expecting warmer temperatures and more drought spells. Another element of the behavior of these animals that is different is the mothering style. And we believe that this also has implications on the way that they use the rangeland. So again, this is a busy table and I'm not going to walk you through all of these data, but what we did here is we recorded with the proximity collars how many times during the day, and if we added up all those contact events, for how long do cows and calves of our heritage, this is the RC here, versus the improved breed, how many times do they come together and for how long? And further, what we looked at is, what was the dam doing when these contacts occurred? So what was the cow, what activity was she engaged in when these contacts occurred? And an important thing we found, and this is probably the only two parts of information here that I will direct you to, is when we compare the activity of the mother when the contacts occurred, we see that significantly more contacts occurred while the heritage cow was grazing versus when compared to the improved breed. And we saw that a significant larger number of contacts occurred while the heritage cow was traveling as opposed to the commercial breed. And so one of the things we've known, and one of the things that colleagues in Mexico have observed, is that with these Criollo cows, the calves follow the mother fairly closely at all times. And these data seem to corroborate that. Improved breeds, such as our British crossbreeds, tend to have a different mothering style. The mother will drop off, quote unquote, the calf with a babysitter and will go off to graze on her own, and then will come back to nurse the calf. and will probably then go off to water on her own and then come back and nurse the calf again and go off to graze again. So we think that these different mothering styles set different levels of constraints on the ability of cows to move around and forage freely in the environment when calves are present. And if you think that these are cow-calf systems, cows have a calf for about 6 months of the year. So half of the year, a cow is engaged in giving birth and bringing up a calf that is eventually weaned and sent to market. So this, we think, is an important factor that might also explain the differences in foraging behavior and in the ability of these animals to use the environment differently that I've described in these earlier telemetry studies. If you look at the maps down here, you can see the difference of rangeland use patterns of your improved beef breed on the left-hand side and the heritage breed, Raramuri Criollo, on the right-hand side. The black dots that you see on the map are all of the points in these pastures where cow-calf contacts occurred. And you can see that the area of exploration and contact is way more extensive and broader in the case of the heritage cattle. Feeding habits are also different. And our expectation when these cows were brought to New Mexico would be that they would have a broader menu of plants that they would feed on. And that by feeding on shrubs more is what we hoped, they would reduce the pressure on some of our valuable herbaceous forages. And recent data collected by Danielle Dunai, a graduate student in our department, that has spent many hours observing these cows in the desert, basically for spring, found that this appears to be true. And we have looked at fecal samples as well. Studies of diet are underway, but it appears that the feeding habits of both breeds are also different, and that this might, of course, also influence their ability to range further, have different spatial distribution patterns, but eventually might also provide them a greater ability to adapt to situations where herbaceous forages might decline on several years, but woody forages might be available. And so this is probably another reason why the thought is that these heritage cattle might be one possible tool to adapt to this new climate scenario. So what are the challenges ahead? There are two important questions that the research still hasn't addressed and that we're in the process of addressing right now. And that is, we've always assumed so far that because heritage cows use the environment so differently, that their footprint on the environment is not as heavy as that of improved beef breeds. But we've never tested this in a controlled environment, and or in a controlled experiment, and that is one of the things that we are trying to do right now. The second very important question is, well, let's suppose that by raising these heritage animals, we can improve the sustainability, the conservation of our native grazing environments. Can a rancher that does this make a living off of it? And so that is the second important question. We know that Criollo cows wean extremely light calves that at that age really don't have commercial value. And so we are currently conducting a study where we're testing a system where you would have a herd of cows that, of heritage cows that have all of these highly desirable traits as far as hardiness and the way they use the landscape. And we would cross them with an improved beef breed bull for them to produce these crossbred calves that would grow to be bigger, would grow faster, and would then be sent off to the feed yard and would be finished in the sort of the mainstream system. We're studying each phase of the beef production system to see if this system could be profitable and if it would work. And so we're comparing it to a traditional straight bred system with animals, commercial beef breeds of higher productivity. When I say we're doing all of these things, we received recently a grant from the USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, a CAP grant, meaning that there is education and extension and research integrated, and we are then studying the benefits of using a heritage breed in our southwestern beef production systems as a way of adapting to climate change. We're also testing the use of modern digital technology to monitor ranch resources and lower the footprint of ranching and lower the costs of ranching as well. And we're also looking at alternative supply chains. So although we're studying all of this in the context of our mainstream beef production system, where animals go from the ranch to a pasture for backgrounding to feedlot and then to slaughter, there's also rapid growth of demand for grass-fed animals that go a different way, that follow the green, that would go from the desert to greener pastures in the Great Plains and would be finished on grass and go to supply the grass-fed market. So this project, of course, is just starting, and it integrates the researchers and extension specialists and NGOs that are working with K through 12 education, but also integrates two geographically distinct areas that are involved in beef production for the Southwest. One is our desert, semi-arid, arid Southwest, where the calves are produced, and the other is the Ogallala Aquifer region, where these calves are finished. And both these regions have their own environmental challenges, but are crucially linked by beef production. So that is what we are doing. And I would like to finish up with this cartoon published by Bob Diven in our local Las Cruces Sun News when news of our grant was made public. And this is the vision of these desert adapted cows and of all these gizmos. You can see the drone here and a camera and some sort of a gateway and so on and so forth. And so the strategy then is to test these old genetics and their ability to adapt and produce in a changing environment, but also use modern cutting edge technology to make these production systems more efficient. So with that, I would like to thank thank you all, of course, and thank the agencies that funded and continue to fund this research. So USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, that is funding this CAP grant. A lot of the previous research was done with funds through the USDA-ARS Jornada Experimental Range and New Mexico State University. And there are a number of institutions involved in this new grant, and you can see their logos there. So I want to thank you again, and I am open for any questions.